So the fighting dies down, and that sets up for now the next phase.
Right.
All right, and you can tell us a little bit about
So Hooker is going to call for some reinforcements, and he has General Edwin Sumner, who's in charge of the Second Corps. McClellan is going to send 2 of his divisions to assist Hooker. They've been east of the creek that morning, so they haven't been in that initial fighting that you just described. And so Sumner's going to send 2 of his own divisions to attack what he thinks is a very vulnerable Confederate left flank. He thinks he can hit Lee on the left and simply roll him up through the Westwoods, so moving north to south, rolling up that left flank. And so his plan is to send a division under John Sedgwick. Sedgwick has about 5,000 men. They are going to start their attack, but it immediately is a problem because they are in a tight formation. And we've talked a bit about linear lines in our opening lecture, but here this is a really tight formation. 5,000 men, they're spread out in brigade-length battle lines that are about 500 yards long. And if we can imagine a football field, think about 500 yards, 5 football fields long, they're only about 50 yards separating each of the brigades. So this is a really tight formation. And what this means is they can't maneuver. They cannot turn to adjust. So they have filed into the Westwoods, again, assuming that there are no Confederates right in front of them. And just at the moment that they enter the Westwoods, they are immediately hit with all of these Confederate reinforcements. This is another place in which going to the battlefield is imperative. You can see the limestone rocks, the outcroppings, the places, the swales in the land that allowed the Confederates to hide. And so Sedgwick is completely caught off guard. Moreover, his men can't maneuver. Right. They can't turn to their left. They can't turn to respond to the Confederates, and they quickly find themselves surrounded from behind. They are almost enveloped. They are surrounded on the left and the right, and eventually from behind, and this just leads to a breaking point.
There's a lot of friendly fire as well.
There's a lot of friendly fire.
Federals try to turn and they shoot into their own men, right?
Absolutely.
As well. Right.
And so Sumner will order them to retreat. He's yelling at them to evacuate the Westwoods, and they're going to start falling back. And he's yelling, back, back, you're in a bad fix. But this, just like the cornfield, this is another incredibly horrific killing ground. There are about 50% casualties here in the Westwoods.
It's the greatest disaster on the Union side that day.
Absolutely.
They're on the cusp, they believe, on a significant victory, right? I mean, Sumner thinks that Westwoods is cleared of any Confederates, and he wouldn't listen to anybody else. McClellan had little faith in Sumner. I don't know, it's because there was a rumor that Sumner's skull was so thick that musket balls would bounce off it.
And that's a great rumor to have.
I suspect it's probably not true.
Probably not.
But I
don't
think
know how you would test that.
It would be a difficult one to test. Yeah. But McClellan certainly did not trust Sumner at all. And of course, what happened in the Westwoods, I think, validated that. I should note that Sumner was so rattled by what happened in the Westwoods that he reported to McClellan basically that nothing more could be done on that flank. That flank's paper thin still, right? And here's again another example of the back and forth, savage, fierce fighting. It almost always ends in a draw, and that's what happens here.
And so this morning fight comes to an end. As the fighting is ending in the Westwoods, the Union attack shifts toward the Confederate center somewhere around 10 o'clock that morning. So what happens? Does McClellan order this attack?
So here's a classic example of where McClellan did not leave his imprint on the battlefield. Now, it is true that Army commanders should not have any control over tactics, but the center of the Confederate line was one of the few places on the battlefield that McClellan could see. And rather than directing and reinforcing and supporting the Union attacks that happened there, he basically held back much-needed reserves to support what amounted to 4 major Union assaults against, you described earlier, the sunken lane. You go there today, you can see that old farmer's lane. It's a perfect defensive position. However, if you look to the front of that Confederate position, you'll note that that open ground that the Union soldiers had to charge across, that open ground often put them on a higher plateau, right? A higher ridge line, looking down into the Confederates. So these classic frontal attacks back and forth, and the Confederates, they embarked upon what would be called like a fluid defense. There's at least 2 Confederate counterattacks that occurred there. So it again, typical of the fighting that occurred on the Confederate left flank happened at the Confederate center as well. Ultimately, the Confederates were overwhelmed really by numbers. There's also some miscommunication of orders in the sunken lane. Some Confederates pull out, which triggered a massive withdrawal, but the Confederate center dissolved. McClellan saw it all, desperate for reinforcements, desperate for artillery. There's the moment. He could have divided Lee's army into two, but he did not do it.
But he didn't. And one of the really important things about visiting this ground is I've often had students that are making that Union attack. Yeah. And if you put people down in the sunken lane, you can see where Confederates held the advantage for such a long period of time. But as soon as those Union troops come up over the hill, then they are standing. It's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel.
It absolutely is. And one of those Union soldiers is an Indiana soldier, David Beam, 14th Indiana, who occupied that high ground looking down into the sunken lane. His regiment suffered terribly, as did the Confederates he was firing into. And after the battle, he wrote this letter to his wife. When I reflect what a terrible ordeal we have passed through and how many have fallen around me, I feel very thankful that I have been so remarkably preserved. I presume that at least a half a dozen men were killed within 6 yards of me, and some of them fell at my feet. What's interesting here, we're going to talk a quote from one of his comrades in the 14th Indiana, William Houghton. I think it's always fascinating how these soldiers make decisions as writers as to what the people back home, what they're going to take from this experience at the sunken lane. So William Houghton, again of the 14th Indiana, wrote on September 20th, I saw many brave boys fall like sheep led to the slaughter. Bryant was shot through the brain. Cord was shot near the heart. And while the lifeblood was gushing from the wound, he sat up and with an almost heavenly smile playing upon his features, he told us he was dying, but to not mind him. Farewell, Captain, he exclaimed. He reached toward him and he fell forward to the earth. Now, the men they were fighting were from Alabama. I have a quote from a survivor of the sunken lane. And what's striking about this quote is that we can sense the deep sense of loss, of mourning that these men felt for comrades that had been killed. They felt so strongly about these men, the men that they fought with. And the sense of loss, it truly overwhelmed them, as we will get a sense of from this Alabama soldier. He wrote on October the 14th, I often think of our trip to Maryland, how many of the brave comrades went into Maryland with bright hopes of the future that are now in the cold grave. I frequently think of Bob. I did not see him when he was shot. Perhaps he was left when he fell, and his bones may whiten on the top of the ground. Tell your father and mother that he died like a patriot and a true soldier, and not as a coward. I wish I could write something that would be encouraging them, but I know nothing, and my heart is too heavy to think of anything. So this great opportunity that was presented to McClellan at the Confederate Center did not capitalize upon it. The fighting then shifted toward the Confederate right flank. Should tell us a little bit about McClellan and his key subordinate down there, Ambrose E. Burnside, who was ordered or instructed to strike the Confederate right flank.
Right, so Burnside, who's in charge of the 9th Corps, has one of the greatest possibilities on the field in terms of getting around the Confederate right flank. They can get around the Confederate right flank. They can cut off access to the ford, Butler's Ford, which is the only avenue of escape that Lee has to get back across the Potomac River. But the problem is the Confederates have probably the most defensible position on the field, overlooking what's called the Lower Bridge, but will soon bear Burnside's name, will come to be known as Burnside's Bridge. And I think it's worth talking for a bit about what this place looks like, what it looked like then and what it looks like now. You can go and stand on the Confederate position. There are about 500 Confederates. They're technically under the command of General Robert Toombs, but Colonel Henry Benning is overseeing the tactical arrangements there. And these are steep bluffs that they're overlooking the slow-moving creek. The creek is only about 20 feet wide, but it's 4 to 4.5 feet deep, means that you can't wade across it. There's no way, and if you do, if you're a soldier, you're going to have to put your rifle above your head to keep it from getting wet.
Yeah, I don't think there's a timeout in battle, right?
No.
There's no timeout.
There's no time to wade the creek and allow that to happen. Right. Confederate also has artillery. They have about 12 guns that are placed on this high ground. And the Georgians are occupying this was an old quarry. There's pits there. They're also in the trees. Again, incredibly strong defensive position.
And you don't need a lot of men there to hold it.
You don't need many men there. And again, Burnside has the entire Ninth Corps at his disposal. The problem on the other side of the creek is that it's a small open area, but it's almost a ravine. And the bridge itself is quite narrow, and so you can't send men rushing across, at least in any force. So this is an incredibly strong position that Burnside is going to have to take on.
Yeah. I think it's worth repeating how strong this Confederate position was, and particularly the bridge. It's a funnel, right? So it brings these attackers into a column position. They're utterly defenseless. There's at least 3 attempts to try to cross the bridge, and they are absolutely gunned down. So people go to Burnside's bridge today, and they like to say, "Well, look at Burnside. He's obsessed with the bridge. Why didn't he just go downstream and cross?"
Well, he was trying to.
He was trying to.
He was trying to. Right. So there's a ford that they've heard about. It's called Snavely's Ford. He's been trying to send men out throughout the day to find this ford where they can cross the creek. Again, it's a creek, but it's not one that you can easily cross. And he's been sending men out. There are bad maps, bad intelligence. So it takes late in the day before they find this place in which the Ninth Corps can cross. So he has, you're absolutely right, he sent several attempts across the bridge, but it's not until late in the afternoon when finally this ford is located and the bulk of the Ninth Corps is able to cross the creek and swing up behind the Confederate.
For the final assault.
For the final assault.
Right. And the assault that for the Federals still has a distinct possibility of crushing Lee's army by cutting Lee off from the ford you mentioned before.
Right.
Boatler's Ford, right? But you can go to today and you can see it, and that's it. And this again is audacity personified, but in such a way that, man, this borderlines on being reckless. We all know, maxim of war, you should not have your army up against a river. And when you got one route to get across to the other side, that is incredibly risky, right? But there is still that chance late in the afternoon after Burnside has crossed Antietam Creek.
Right, so about 1 o'clock, Burnside manages to cross the creek. The bridge is in Union hands. This is what they've been trying to do, but it's come at a significant cost.
Absolutely.
Going after that bridge all afternoon long.
Absolutely. He still has, Burnside has about 8,000 men, right? So he has a massive front. And I just want to again keep sort of plugging our Park Service friends. I don't think there's another battlefield in the Eastern Theater that any park has done a better job than Antietam in creating trails so that you can walk in the footsteps of these men. You can walk Burnside's attack from the steep bluffs above Burnside's Bridge, or what would be called Burnside's Bridge, all the way to the Confederate final line, which is on the outskirts of the town of Sharpsburg.
Absolutely.
But you got to be in shape, because there is rugged ground. It's the most treacherous territory anywhere on the battlefield. It's up and down and up and down. And you can easily imagine that late afternoon assault, long lines of Federal troops as they go toward their goal, right? And that is to cut Lee's army off from the Potomac. It was such a desperate situation. This, I believe, is the first time that R.E. Lee ever came under fire. He is on the edge of town, trying to rally stragglers, creating again it's a paper-thin line. And as the Federals make their advance, and this is just what had happened throughout the day. They're on the cusp of delivering that knockout blow, but who arrived at the very last moment? None other than, go ahead, Carrie, you did it.
It was A.P. Hill.
Of course,
A.P. Hill's come in from Harper's Ferry. So tell us about that final assault.
Yeah.
What happens?
So what happens in that final assault, that the Federals, again, they're on the verge of breaking the Confederate line, and A.P. Hill's men who started the day at Harper's Ferry, how long is that march? 12 to 15 miles, somewhere in that range. They're going hard. There's a fair amount of straggling, but when they reach the scene, it's right at the perfect time for the Confederates and at the perfect place, because they struck Burnside's line right at the left flank. The farthest most regiment was a Connecticut regiment. They had just gotten to service. Hell, many of these men didn't even know how to work their guns. They're down in a low ground, and AP Hill's men devour them, right? Devour them. And that, of course, destabilized the entire front for Burnside. So right when Sharpsburg and the Confederate right flank were about ready to collapse, AP Hill's arrival sent Burnside's men reeling backwards. And so what do we have? We have the armies occupying the ground that they basically held when the day started, right? This slugfest has amounted almost, right, to no advantage gain on either side.
Had anything changed? Is there a clear victor?
There's not a clear victor here. Both sides will make their case that they were the victorious one. For the federal side or the northern side, it was enough of a victory because R.E. Lee retreated not on the 18th, but on the 19th, going across Butler's Ford. And with that retreat, that was enough for Abraham Lincoln to make the claim, right, that this was a Union victory. But the day's casualties, of course, they were extraordinary. There were over 23,000 men fell in a single day. It's the bloodiest day of the Civil War. And only if you go to that battlefield and walk that ground can you fully appreciate why that fighting was so intense, why it was so bloody. Great irony is, it is a stalemate. Neither side gained a decisive advantage in a military sense, but politically, Lincoln now has that battle, that victory, that he can declare the preliminary emancipation. And so in our next lecture, we'll talk about the revolutionary consequences of a battle that was basically a draw.